Translate this if you can. Ethan Caldwell didn't raise his voice, but he didn't have to, because in a room where every glass cost more than a week's rent and every handshake could move millions of dollars, silence carried more weight than sound, and at that moment, every conversation at the table thinned into a quiet tension that settled just above the polished marble floor, the skyline of Manhattan glowing behind floor-to-ceiling windows like a reminder that power here wasn't just spoken. It was assumed, worn in. Tailored suits reflected in aged bourbon, and measured in who got listened to and who didn't, and Naomi Brooks, standing just half a step behind Ethan's chair with a tray balanced effortlessly in one hand, knew exactly which side of that equation she was supposed to be on, because to them she was invisible, just another black waitress moving between tables, quiet, efficient, replaceable, the kind of presence that existed only when needed and disappeared the moment attention shifted elsewhere. But what no one at that table noticed, not the investors leaning back in their chairs or the executives exchanging knowing smirks, was that Naomi had already heard everything, every word Ethan had spoken in Italian over the last 20 minutes, every subtle shift in tone, every coded phrase wrapped in polished foreign syllables meant to glide over the heads of anyone not meant to understand, and she had understood it all, not because she was trying to listen, but because once you know a language, it doesn't matter if it's whispered or disguised, meaning has a way of finding you. And now Ethan was looking at her, not really seeing her, but acknowledging her just enough to turn her into a moment of entertainment, a brief diversion in an otherwise controlled evening. His expression calm, confident, almost amused as he repeated the sentence again in flawless Italian, slower this time, as if speaking to someone who needed extra time to catch up. And a few people at the table let out quiet chuckles, not loud enough to seem rude but clear enough to signal where they thought this was going. Because in rooms like this assumptions were currency, and the assumption was simple: she wouldn't understand, she couldn't, not here, not dressed in a standard black uniform, not carrying a tray instead of a portfolio, and Naomi felt the weight of that expectation settle around her like the dim amber lighting above, warm but limiting, familiar in a way that didn't sting anymore, just existed like gravity, like background noise, like something you learn to move through without letting it define your steps. And for a second, just a second, she said nothing, not out of hesitation but out of choice, because timing she had learned mattered just as much as truth, and the room leaned into that silence, waiting for her to stumble, waiting for confirmation that everything was exactly as it appeared, that the lines between power and service were fixed and predictable. And then Naomi lifted her gaze, steady, unhurried, her voice calm, clear, and unmistakably fluent as she answered him in Italian, not translating, not simplifying, but responding with precision, with the kind of ease that doesn't come from memorization but from understanding. And in that instant something shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a glass set down just a little too hard or a breath held a second too long, because the room didn't erupt, it didn't gasp, it didn't react the way movies might suggest. It simply went still, completely unnaturally still. And for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell didn't look like the man who owned the room. He looked like someone who had just realized he had been heard all along. No one laughed this time, not because they suddenly respected her, but because they did not know how to respond when something did not fit the script they had already written in their minds. And that was the real disruption, not her words, but the way they forced everyone at the table to reconsider what they thought they understood. Because Naomi did not raise her voice, she did not add emphasis, she simply held the moment steady, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if answering in Italian was no more remarkable than refilling a glass of water, and that contrast made it impossible to dismiss, because confidence without performance is harder to ignore than confidence that begs for attention. And Ethan felt it immediately, the subtle shift in control, the way the room was no longer moving in the direction he had intended. And for a man who built his entire identity around control, even a small deviation carried weight, so he leaned back slightly, studying her now with a different kind of focus, not curiosity but calculation, the kind that measures risk, that searches for context, that tries to understand how something unexpected fits into a system that is supposed to be predictable. And across the table, one of the investors cleared his throat, attempting to restart the rhythm of the evening, but the timing was off, the cadence broken, because once a room has been made aware of something it overlooked, it cannot return to the same version of itself, and Naomi could feel their attention now, not openly, not directly, but in the small pauses, the sideways glances, the way conversations resumed a fraction slower than before. And still she said nothing more, because she had not come here to prove anything, she had come here to work, and yet she also understood something they did not, that information carries power even when it is not used, and she had more of it than they realized, because the conversation Ethan had been having in Italian earlier had not been casual, it had been deliberate, layered, filled with implications that were never meant to be shared with the entire table. And now that she had revealed she could understand, the unspoken question hung in the air. How much had she heard? How much did she know? And more importantly, what would she do with it? And Ethan's fingers tapped once against the edge of his glass, a small, controlled motion, but enough to reveal that he was thinking several steps ahead, recalibrating, because this was no longer about a simple test, it was about exposure, about the possibility that something private had been unintentionally made visible. And for the first time that night, he chose his next words more carefully, switching back to English, his tone lighter, almost dismissive, as if the moment had been nothing more than a clever surprise. But the shift itself was the signal, because men like Ethan did not change language unless there was a reason, and Naomi noticed it, of course she did, because she noticed everything, the hesitation, the recalculation, the subtle retreat, and she adjusted just as quietly, stepping back into her role, offering a refill to the nearest guest with the same composed efficiency as before, giving the room exactly what it expected on the surface while holding on to what it had not yet realized beneath. And as the skyline outside shimmered against the glass, reflecting a city built on ambition and perception, the balance of the room had already begun to tilt, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would not be undone, because once someone invisible is seen, truly seen, they are never invisible again. The conversation tried to recover its rhythm, but something invisible had already rewritten the tempo, because now every word spoken at that table carried an extra layer of awareness, an unspoken question lingering beneath the surface of every sentence, and Ethan could feel it even as he guided the discussion forward, his voice smooth, controlled, shifting back into the language of numbers and projections, market expansion, acquisition timelines, the kind of language that built empires and reassured investors. But beneath that polished delivery there was a new calculation running, one that had nothing to do with revenue or strategy and everything to do with the woman who had just quietly altered the balance of the room without ever stepping out of her role. And Naomi continued moving between the guests with the same measured precision, placing plates, adjusting glasses, her presence once again blending into the background, but now it was a different kind of invisibility, not absence but choice, because she knew something they did not, that power is often strongest when it is not announced. And as she approached the far end of the table, she caught fragments of the resumed discussion, English now carefully neutral, deliberately simplified, and that confirmed what she had already understood. Ethan was no longer speaking freely, he was managing information, and that shift told her everything, because earlier when he spoke in Italian, there had been no restraint, no filtering, just confidence wrapped in a language he assumed no one else would follow, and in that confidence, he had said more than he intended, more than he realized, and Naomi replayed those words in her mind with quiet clarity, the phrasing, the implications, the subtle distinction between what was promised at the table and what was planned beyond it, and she did not react, not outwardly, because reaction would draw attention, and attention would force a moment before its time, and timing, she understood, was everything. And across the table one of the senior partners leaned forward, asking a direct question about the structure of the deal, something specific, something that required precision, and Ethan answered without hesitation, his tone steady, but now every answer was being listened to more closely than before, not just by the investors, but by the space itself, because the earlier silence had changed the way people heard. And Naomi stepped closer to refill a glass, just within range of the conversation, her movements fluid, unintrusive, but her attention sharp, and when Ethan responded, there it was again, the difference, subtle but unmistakable. The version he presented now did not fully match the version he had described in Italian, not in wording, not in intent, and Naomi felt that realization settle into place, not as shock but as confirmation, because she had already suspected it, already understood that what sounded impressive on the surface might not hold the same integrity underneath. And still she said nothing, because this was not her conversation, not yet, and the room continued, the skyline glowing, the glasses clinking softly, the illusion of control carefully maintained, but beneath it, something had already shifted beyond repair, because Ethan was no longer the only one in control of what was understood, and Naomi, standing just behind the line where she was expected to exist and nothing more, now held a quiet advantage that no one at that table had accounted for, not when they dismissed her, not when they tested her, and certainly not when they assumed she would never hear what was never meant for her. It happened in a moment so small most people would have missed it. A slight pause before Ethan answered the next question. A fraction of a second where confidence hesitated and calculation stepped in. And to everyone else it looked like nothing, just a man choosing his words carefully in a high-stakes conversation. But to Naomi it was confirmation, because hesitation only appears when something needs to be adjusted, and Ethan was adjusting, not because he lacked knowledge, but because he now understood he was no longer the only one in the room who could interpret what was being said and what was being hidden, and that realization pressed quietly against his composure, not breaking it but reshaping it, and across the table the investors leaned in again, sensing that the conversation was approaching something decisive, the kind of moment where agreements begin to solidify into commitments, where numbers stop being projections and start becoming promises, and Ethan responded with clarity, outlining terms, timelines, expectations, each sentence structured, each phrase intentional, but the more he spoke, the more the subtle differences emerged, not obvious contradictions, not anything that could be called out without precision, but small shifts in emphasis, slight reframing of risk, careful omissions that softened the edges of what he had previously described in Italian, and Naomi stood just close enough to hear it all. Her expression unchanged, her posture steady, her presence still contained within the role they expected her to play, but inside, she was aligning the two versions, the private and the public, the confident and the careful, and the gap between them was not wide, but it was real, and in rooms like this, even the smallest gap could carry consequences measured in millions, and one of the partners asked to follow up, sharper this time, more specific, as if something in Ethan's tone had triggered a need for clarity, and the question hung in the air, direct and unavoidable, and Ethan answered again, smoothly, almost flawlessly, but Naomi heard it, the shift, the way the answer leaned just slightly away from the truth he had spoken earlier. And that was the moment the balance tipped, not outwardly, not in a way anyone could point to, but internally, because now the situation was no longer just about observation, it was about choice, and Naomi felt that choice settle in front of her with quiet weight, not forced, not urgent, but undeniable, because she could remain exactly where they believed she belonged, invisible, uninvolved, carrying plates and clearing glasses while the conversation continued on its carefully constructed path, or she could step into a space no one had prepared for her to occupy, a space where her voice would not just be heard, but would change the direction of everything unfolding in that room, and the difference between those two paths was not about courage alone, it was about timing, about knowing not just what to say but when to say it, and Naomi had spent years learning that lesson in ways no one at that table could see, in classrooms she could no longer afford, in nights spent studying languages not because anyone asked her to, but because she understood that knowledge builds options and options create moments, and moments when used correctly can shift entire outcomes. And as Ethan reached the end of his explanation, his voice steady, his posture composed, his control nearly restored, Naomi took a single quiet breath, not to prepare herself, but to mark the moment, because she knew something they did not, that the next words spoken in that room would not come from the man everyone expected to lead the conversation, but from the woman no one had expected to matter at all. "That is not what you said." Naomi's voice did not cut through the room, it settled into it, calm and even, yet impossible to ignore, and for a brief second no one reacted because the sentence itself did not sound disruptive, it sounded precise, almost helpful, the kind of quiet correction someone might offer in a professional setting, but the weight of it did not come from volume, it came from timing, because she spoke exactly when the room believed the conversation had reached clarity, exactly when Ethan's explanation had restored enough confidence to move forward, and that was why every eye turned, not sharply, not dramatically, but slowly, collectively, as if the entire table had just realized something had shifted again, and Naomi did not rush to explain herself. She did not fill the silence with justification, she simply held her position, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, the other still holding the tray, her posture composed, her presence steady, and that restraint made her words land harder than any raised voice could have, because now the room had to decide whether to dismiss her or to listen, and dismissal requires certainty, and certainty had already been disrupted, and Ethan felt it before anyone else spoke. The way attention moved away from him for the first time that night, not completely, but enough to fracture the control he had been rebuilding, and he turned toward her, his expression controlled, almost neutral, but there was something new beneath it, not anger, not yet, but awareness, the recognition that this moment mattered in a way the previous one had not, and when he spoke, His tone was measured, careful, as if choosing each word with precision, asking her politely to clarify what she meant, and Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, not challenging, not submissive, simply present, and then she spoke again, this time not in Italian, not in fragments, but in clear, deliberate English, translating what he had said earlier when he believed no one else understood, not adding anything, not exaggerating, just repeating the substance of his own words, the version that included the conditions he had quietly intended to adjust later, the version that reframed risk in a way that was not reflected in the explanation he had just given. And as she spoke, the room did not interrupt, because now it was not about who she was, it was about what she was saying, and the distinction between those two things changed everything, and one of the investors leaned back slightly, his expression tightening just enough to signal that he was processing the difference. Another shifted in his seat, glancing between Ethan and Naomi as if recalculating the situation in real time, and Ethan listened, completely still, not because he agreed, but because interrupting would confirm more than it would conceal, and when Naomi finished, she did not look around for validation, she did not wait for a reaction, she simply stepped back into stillness, allowing the room to absorb what had just been placed in front of it. And the silence that followed was not empty, it was full, dense with reconsideration, because what had been revealed was not just a discrepancy in language, it was a question of trust, and in a room built on agreements worth millions of dollars, trust was not a detail, it was the foundation, and for the first time that night, the conversation no longer belonged to the man who had entered the room expecting to lead it. It belonged to the truth that had just been spoken by the one person no one had expected to speak at all. No one spoke immediately, not because they did not have something to say, but because they understood that anything said too quickly would reveal more than intended. And in a room where every word carried weight, hesitation became the only safe response, and Ethan remained still, his posture composed, his expression controlled, but the silence around him was no longer his to command, it was evaluating him, measuring him in a way that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with credibility. And across the table, the lead investor finally leaned forward, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but with the kind of quiet authority that does not need to raise its voice to redirect a conversation, asking Ethan to clarify the difference between the version Naomi had just translated and the explanation he had given moments earlier. And it was a simple request on the surface, just a question, but the kind of question that does not allow for vague answers, and Ethan understood that immediately because this was no longer about presentation, it was about alignment, and alignment leaves no room for interpretation, so he responded carefully, choosing his words with precision, explaining that the earlier phrasing had been contextual, that certain details were still under discussion, that nothing had been finalized, and his tone remained steady, professional, almost reassuring, but something had already changed, because now every word he spoke was being compared, not just heard, and Naomi, standing just outside the center of the table, could feel that shift settle deeper into the room, the way attention had sharpened, the way assumptions had loosened, the way certainty had been replaced by scrutiny, and she did not move, did not speak again because she did not need to, her role in the moment was complete, and that was the part no one expected, not the correction itself, but the restraint that followed, because she was not trying to win the room, she was simply allowing it to see clearly, and that clarity carried its own momentum, because once doubt enters a negotiation, it does not disappear on its own. It expands quietly, steadily, reshaping the way every detail is interpreted, and one of the partners exchanged a brief glance with another, subtle but meaningful, the kind of glance that signals recalculation, and another asked a follow-up question, more direct this time, focusing on specific terms, asking for confirmation, asking for transparency, and Ethan answered again, still composed, still controlled, but now the rhythm of the conversation had shifted permanently, because he was no longer leading, he was responding. And that distinction, though subtle, was everything, and Naomi watched it unfold without expression, her presence returning to the edges of the room where she was expected to exist, but the impact of her words remained at the center, shaping the conversation in ways no one could ignore. And as the skyline outside continued to glow against the glass, reflecting a city built on ambition and perception, the truth had already done its work, not loudly, not dramatically, but effectively, because in a space where power was measured by who controlled the narrative had just changed, and it had not changed because someone demanded attention, it had changed because someone who was never meant to be heard chose the exact right moment to speak, and then chose to step back and let the room decide what that truth was worth. The room did not collapse, it recalibrated, and that was far more dangerous because collapse is loud and visible, but recalibration is quiet and precise, the kind of shift that happens behind composed faces and measured breaths. And Ethan could see it now, not in dramatic reactions but in the details, the way one investor no longer nodded as quickly, the way another began taking notes with a slower, more deliberate rhythm, the way questions started forming not from curiosity but from verification, and that was the moment he understood that control had not been taken from him all at once. It had been redistributed, piece by piece, into the hands of everyone now reconsidering what they had just heard. And across the table, the lead investor adjusted his posture slightly, no longer leaning forward in anticipation, but sitting back in evaluation, a subtle change that carried weight, because anticipation assumes trust, but evaluation demands proof, and Ethan responded as expected, refining his explanation, tightening his language, aligning his statements with greater care. But the effort itself revealed something, because when confidence is natural, it flows, and when it is reconstructed, it becomes visible in its precision. And Naomi, now once again moving quietly along the edge of the room, observed it without expression, her role outwardly unchanged, yet fundamentally different, because she was no longer just part of the setting, she had become part of the equation, and even those who avoided looking directly at her could not fully ignore the presence of what she represented, a variable that had not been accounted for, a reminder that perception is not always accurate, and that underestimation carries consequences that cannot be undone once exposed. And as the discussion continued, the questions grew sharper, not confrontational but exact, focused on specifics, on definitions, on the small details that determine whether an agreement holds or unravels, and Ethan answered each one with discipline, maintaining composure, maintaining professionalism, but the rhythm was no longer his to dictate. It belonged to the scrutiny that now guided the conversation, and in that shift, something deeper surfaced, not just doubt about a deal, but a broader awareness, because the room had witnessed something it could not easily categorize, a moment where status had not predicted capability, where expectation had not matched reality, and that kind of moment lingers, influencing decisions beyond the immediate, and Naomi understood that, not as a strategy, but as a truth she had lived long before this night, that being overlooked does not diminish what you know, it only delays when others are forced to see it, and she did not linger in the center of attention, did not claim the space she had just altered, because her strength was not in occupying the spotlight, it was in knowing when to step into it and when to step out, and as she placed another glass gently onto the table, her movements as steady as ever, the room continued its quiet transformation, because the conversation was no longer about what Ethan wanted to present, it was about what everyone else needed to confirm, and in that difference the outcome had already begun to change, not through confrontation, not through force but through clarity, the kind that does not demand attention, yet once revealed cannot be ignored. By the time the conversation reached its final stretch, the decision had already been made, not with a formal announcement, not with a dramatic rejection, but through the quiet language that experienced people use when trust begins to thin, the slight distancing in tone, the careful phrasing that replaces enthusiasm with caution, and Ethan recognized it even before anyone said a word that confirmed it, because he had built enough deals to know the difference between momentum and hesitation. And this was hesitation, layered, deliberate, irreversible, and across the table the lead investor finally closed his notebook, not abruptly, not in frustration, but with a calm finality that carried more meaning than any raised voice could have, thanking Ethan for the presentation, acknowledging the opportunity, but suggesting that additional review would be needed before moving forward, and it was a sentence designed to remain polite while signaling distance, the kind of sentence that sounds open, but rarely returns to the same table in the same way, and Ethan nodded because there was nothing else to do, his expression steady, his posture unchanged, but the room no longer responded to him. As it had at the beginning of the evening, the energy had shifted, not against him, but away from him, and that distinction mattered because being opposed can be challenged, but being reconsidered cannot be forced back into certainty, and Naomi stood near the far end of the room, her role once again fully intact, clearing a glass, adjusting a plate, moving with the same quiet rhythm she had maintained all night, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the air, not attached to her directly, not acknowledged openly, yet present in the way conversations resumed without returning to their original confidence. And as the guests began to rise from their seats, jackets adjusted, watches checked, final handshakes exchanged, The evening closed with the kind of polished professionalism that leaves no visible trace of disruption, yet carries it forward into every decision that follows, and Ethan gathered his things with controlled efficiency, offering measured farewells, his tone consistent, his composure intact, but something fundamental had shifted, not in his authority, but in how it had been perceived, and perception in rooms like this is the foundation everything else rests on. And as he turned to leave, his gaze passed over Naomi for just a brief moment, not long enough to draw attention, but long enough to acknowledge what could no longer be ignored, not who she was in title, but what she had done in timing. And Naomi did not respond, did not hold the moment, did not claim it, because she understood something deeper than recognition, that the value of what she had done was not in being seen afterward, but in what had been seen because of her. And as the doors closed behind the last guest and the skyline continued to glow beyond the glass, the room returned to its quiet state, polished, composed, unchanged on the surface, yet fundamentally different in what it had revealed, because power had entered the room expecting to test, and left having been measured instead, not by force, not by volume, but by truth delivered at exactly the moment it could no longer be ignored. The room emptied the way it always did, quietly, efficiently, as if nothing remarkable had taken place, chairs pushed in with soft precision, glasses cleared, the low hum of conversation replaced by the distant rhythm of the city outside, and for anyone walking in. At that moment it would have looked like just another finished evening, another deal discussed, another group of powerful people moving on to their next decision, but what could not be seen was what had shifted beneath that polished surface, because moments like this do not leave visible marks, they leave altered perceptions, and those perceptions follow people long after the lights dim and the doors close, and Naomi moved through the final steps of her shift with the same steady focus she had carried all night, stacking plates, wiping the edges of the table, restoring order to a space that had briefly revealed something deeper than its appearance. And no one stopped her, no one asked for her name, no one turned the moment into a spectacle, because the kind of impact she created does not demand recognition, it redefines it. And across the room, Ethan paused near the exit for just a second longer than necessary, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because he understood something now that had not existed when he first walked in, that control is not just about what you say, but about what others understand, and once understanding shifts, control must adjust with it. And he left without looking back, his posture still composed, his presence still commanding, but the certainty that had once surrounded him no longer moved with the same ease. And Naomi did not watch him go, because she did not need to. The outcome had already spoken for itself, and as she finished clearing the last place setting, she paused for a brief moment, not to reflect on what had happened, but to acknowledge what it meant, not just for the room but for herself, because there is a difference between being overlooked and being without value, and she had never confused the two, not in the long hours, not in the quiet judgments, not in the assumptions that came with a uniform and a role, and tonight had not changed who she was. It had simply revealed it to others in a way they could no longer ignore, and that is the part most people misunderstand, that moments of recognition are not about transformation, they are about exposure, about bringing into view what was always there, waiting, steady, patient, ready for the right moment to be seen. And Naomi picked up her tray, her movements as calm as they had been at the beginning of the night, her expression unchanged, because she did not need the room to validate what she already knew. And as the lights softened and the skyline continued its endless glow beyond the glass, the truth of the evening settled into something simple, something quiet, something lasting, that power can fill a room, but it does not define it, because sometimes, the person who changes everything is the one no one thought to notice. And she did not raise her voice, she did not claim the spotlight, she did not ask for anything in return, she simply chose the exact moment to speak, and that was enough.